The 11th of April, 1951. President Harry Truman sat alone in the Oval Office at 1 a.m., holding a single sheet of paper, the order relieving General Douglas MacArthur of command. His hand didn't shake as he signed it. He'd been preparing for this moment for 6 years, ever since he realized the catastrophic mistake Franklin Roosevelt had made. A mistake that had poisoned civil-military relations, emboldened a general to believe he answered to no one, and created a crisis Truman knew would eventually land on his desk. Roosevelt had let MacArthur run wild for 5 years during World War II. Truman wasn't going to repeat that error, even if it destroyed his presidency. The roots of this confrontation stretched back to 1942, when MacArthur was commanding Allied forces in the Pacific after his dramatic escape from the Philippines. Roosevelt needed MacArthur's larger-than-life persona for propaganda purposes. The brilliant general who would avenge Pearl Harbor and crush Japan. But Roosevelt also knew something the American public didn't. MacArthur was virtually uncontrollable, regularly ignored presidential directives, and operated as if civilian authority was merely a suggestion. In July 1942, Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs decided the primary Pacific offensive should go through the Central Pacific under Admiral Nimitz. Sound strategy, the Navy-dominated route was shorter and leveraged America's naval advantages. MacArthur violently disagreed. He wanted the main offensive through his Southwest Pacific Command, through New Guinea and the Philippines. It would take longer, cost more lives, but it would make Douglas MacArthur the hero who liberated the Philippines. Here is what MacArthur did next. He didn't just argue through military channels. He went around Roosevelt entirely, gave interviews to friendly journalists, leaked information to Republican congressmen who hated Roosevelt, made public statements contradicting official policy. He told reporters the Central Pacific strategy was a Navy power grab, implied Roosevelt was making military decisions for political rather than strategic reasons. It was insubordination bordering on mutiny. Roosevelt's response: nothing. He was annoyed, sure, complained to aides that MacArthur was impossible to manage. But Roosevelt never disciplined him, never publicly contradicted him, never threatened to relieve him of command. Why? Because Roosevelt had made a political calculation. MacArthur was too popular to fire. Republicans loved him. The press worshipped him. Firing MacArthur would create a political firestorm that could damage Roosevelt's 1944 re-election prospects. So Roosevelt accommodated MacArthur, gave him more resources than strategy required. Let the general have his way. The worst incident came in October 1944 at Leyte Gulf. MacArthur, in his characteristic megalomania, staged a public relations spectacle that made Roosevelt furious, but which Roosevelt again refused to punish. MacArthur arranged to wade ashore with photographers capturing the moment, delivering his "I have returned" speech for the cameras. Pure theatre, carefully choreographed for maximum dramatic impact. But here is the problem. MacArthur had waded ashore hours before the beach was actually secure, endangering himself and his staff for a photo opportunity. Worse, he did it without informing his naval and air commanders, who had to scramble to provide unplanned protection for the general's publicity stunt. When Roosevelt learned about this, he was livid, told his military aide Admiral Leahy, "That is the most reckless, self-aggrandizing thing I've ever heard." MacArthur risked his life and his staff for a photograph. What if he'd been killed by a Japanese sniper? The entire Pacific Command structure would have collapsed. Leahy asked what Roosevelt wanted to do about it. Roosevelt's answer: "Nothing, we can't. He is too popular." It was classic Roosevelt: recognize the problem, complain about it, but refuse to confront it because of political considerations. MacArthur's insubordination continued through the end of the war. In March 1945, he publicly criticized the decision to use atomic bombs on Japan, saying his ground forces could win without them if given proper support. He was contradicting presidential policy, questioning the weapon Truman would soon have to decide whether to use. Again, no consequences. When Harry Truman became president in April 1945, he inherited this situation: a general who had spent 3 years ignoring presidential authority and facing no consequences. Truman, who had been an artillery captain in World War I, was appalled. He told his staff, Roosevelt let MacArthur run wild because he was afraid of the political consequences of reining him in. That was a mistake. Civilian control of the military isn't optional, it is constitutional, and I won't compromise on it. But Truman didn't act immediately, in 1945 and 46. With World War II just ended, and MacArthur overseeing the occupation of Japan, Truman judged it wasn't the time for a confrontation. MacArthur was doing reasonably well in Japan, implementing democratic reforms. The political cost of firing him would be enormous. So Truman watched, waited, and quietly documented every instance of MacArthur's insubordination, building a case he might need someday. That day came on the 25th of June 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea. Truman, acting through the United Nations, committed American forces to defend South Korea and appointed MacArthur as commander of UN forces. It seemed logical. MacArthur was in Japan, knew the region, was America's most celebrated general, but Truman knew it was risky. He told Secretary of State Dean Acheson, "I am giving MacArthur this command, but I am watching him closely. He has got a history of thinking he knows better than the president. If he pulls that with me, I'll relieve him. I don't care how popular he is." The warning signs appeared immediately. In July 1950, MacArthur flew to Formosa to meet with Chiang Kai-shek without authorization from Truman. The visit was interpreted as American commitment to defend Taiwan against Communist China, which contradicted Truman's policy of not getting involved in the Chinese Civil War. When Truman demanded an explanation, MacArthur claimed it was just a courtesy visit. Truman didn't believe him, but let it go with a warning. In August, MacArthur sent a message to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention that directly criticized Truman's Asia policy, arguing for a more aggressive stance toward Communist China. Truman was furious and ordered MacArthur to withdraw the message. MacArthur did, but only after it had already been published in multiple newspapers. It was calculated insubordination. He appeared to comply while ensuring the damage was already done. Truman told his staff, "This is exactly what Roosevelt tolerated from MacArthur during the war. I won't tolerate it. One more incident, and he is done." The crisis came in late November 1950. MacArthur had launched a major offensive to end the Korean War, promising Truman that American forces would be home by Christmas. He assured Truman and the Joint Chiefs that there was little risk of Chinese intervention. He was catastrophically wrong. On the 25th of November, 300,000 Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River and smashed into MacArthur's overextended forces. It was a devastating military defeat, one of the worst in American history. MacArthur's response to this disaster: blame everyone but himself and demand a massive expansion of the war. He wanted to bomb China, including potentially using atomic bombs. He wanted to use nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan to invade mainland China. He wanted, essentially, to start World War I too. And when Truman said no, that the United States would not expand the war into China, MacArthur began publicly undermining the president. In December 1950, MacArthur gave an interview to U.S. News and World Report criticizing Truman's limited war strategy. In March 1951, MacArthur issued a statement threatening China with expanded military action if they didn't negotiate surrender, directly sabotaging Truman's diplomatic efforts to arrange a ceasefire. Then on the 5th of April 1951 came the final straw. House Republican leader Joseph Martin read on the floor of Congress a letter from MacArthur criticizing Truman's Korea policy and arguing for MacArthur's alternative strategy. Truman read the letter and made his decision immediately. He called in his top advisers, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley, and Chief of Staff Averell Harriman. Truman told them, "Gentlemen, MacArthur has left me no choice. He is publicly defying presidential authority. He is trying to dictate foreign policy. He is attempting to start a wider war that I've explicitly forbidden. This is insubordination, and I am going to relieve him of command." The advisers were split. Marshall himself, a five-star general and the most respected military figure in America, supported Truman's decision. He said, "Mr. President, military officers don't get to make foreign policy. They don't get to publicly contradict the commander-in-chief. MacArthur has crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. You have to fire him." Omar Bradley agreed. "MacArthur has forgotten that he works for you. Not the other way around. This isn't about career strategy. It is about civilian control of the military. You have to act." But Harriman, the political operative, warned, "Mr. President, this will be the most controversial decision of your presidency. MacArthur is beloved. You'll be accused of losing Korea, of appeasing communism, of firing a great general out of petty spite. Republicans will crucify you. Your approval ratings will tank. Are you sure you want to do this?" Truman's response was immediate and firm. A virile, "I don't care." Franklin Roosevelt let MacArthur run roughshod over presidential authority for 5 years because he was worried about the political consequences. It was wrong then, and it would be wrong now. The Constitution says the president is commander-in-chief, not MacArthur, me, and I'm going to enforce that. Truman spent the next few days reviewing every instance of MacArthur's insubordination since June Fay, building an overwhelming case. Marshall helped by documenting the military's perspective. MacArthur had disobeyed orders, misled his superiors about Chinese intentions, and was now publicly advocating policies that could trigger World War III. The Joint Chiefs unanimously supported relieving MacArthur on April 5th. Truman met with his advisers one final time. He asked each of them directly, "Do you support relieving General MacArthur?" Marshall, "Yes." Bradley, "Yes." The other Joint Chiefs, "Yes." Atchison, "Yes." Harriman, the political adviser, hesitated, but finally said, "Mr. President, politically, it is a disaster. But constitutionally, it is necessary, so yes." Truman said, "Then it is decided. Draft the order." The order was drafted that evening. It was brutally simple. "I deeply regret that it becomes my duty as President and Commander-in-Chief of the United States Military Forces to replace you as Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, Commander-in-Chief United Nations Command, Commander-in-Chief Far East, and Commanding General U.S. Army Far East. You will turn over your commands, effective at once, to Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway." Truman signed it on April 5th. The plan was to deliver it to MacArthur through proper military channels on April 5th, giving MacArthur time to prepare for the transition. But on April 5th, a reporter got wind of the story. Truman's press secretary came to him urgently. The Chicago Tribune was about to publish that MacArthur was being fired. If MacArthur learned about it from the press, rather than official channels, it would be an additional humiliation. Truman made a snap decision. Announce it immediately. At 5 a.m. on April 5th, Truman held a press conference announcing that General Douglas MacArthur had been relieved of all his commands. The reporters were stunned. By dawn, the news was on every radio station and newspaper front page in America. President Truman had fired General MacArthur. The reaction was explosive. Republicans were apoplectic. Senator Joseph McCarthy called it the greatest victory the communists have ever won. Senator Richard Nixon said Truman had lost his nerve. Senator Robert Taft suggested Truman should be impeached. Newspapers across the country condemned the decision. Truman's approval rating, already low because of the Korean stalemate, dropped to 23%. One of the lowest presidential approval ratings ever recorded. Truman received death threats. Telegrams poured into the White House, running 20-1 against the decision, but Truman never wavered. In a cabinet meeting the day after firing MacArthur, he explained his reasoning. "Gentlemen, I know this is unpopular. I know MacArthur is a hero to many Americans, but the principle at stake is more important than popularity. If I let MacArthur defy presidential authority without consequences, I establish a precedent that generals can make foreign policy, that they can publicly contradict the commander-in-chief, that they can refuse to follow orders they disagree with. That is not how democracies work. That is how military dictatorships start." Truman then said something that revealed how much Roosevelt's mistake had influenced his thinking. Roosevelt faced this exact situation with MacArthur during World War II. MacArthur regularly ignored orders, undermined policy, and put his own ambitions ahead of military objectives. And Roosevelt did nothing because he was afraid of the political cost. That was wrong. It set a precedent that MacArthur could operate outside civilian control. I'm correcting that mistake. Yes, it is costing me politically, but some things are more important than poll numbers. MacArthur returned to the United States to a hero's welcome. 7 million people lined the streets of San Francisco for his parade. He addressed a joint session of Congress, giving his famous "Old Soldiers Never Die" speech that had many representatives in tears. Republican leaders pushed MacArthur to run for president in Fay to challenge Truman and vindicate himself. The national mood seemed overwhelmingly pro-MacArthur and anti-Truman. But then something interesting happened. The Senate held hearings on MacArthur's dismissal. For weeks, senators questioned MacArthur, the Joint Chiefs, and Truman's advisors about what had really happened in Korea. And the more MacArthur testified, the worse he looked. He was arrogant, dismissive of questions, contemptuous of civilian authority. He admitted he had disagreed with presidential policy and had taken actions to undermine it. He confirmed that he had wanted to expand the war into China and use atomic weapons against explicit presidential orders. Meanwhile, the Joint Chiefs testified in support of Truman's decision. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, gave devastating testimony. General MacArthur's strategy would have involved us in the wrong war at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. He explained that MacArthur had disobeyed orders, misled his superiors, and was attempting to dictate foreign policy. Even Republicans on the committee were shaken by how clearly MacArthur had overstepped his authority. Public opinion began to shift. People started asking, if all the other generals agreed MacArthur had to go, maybe Truman was right. If MacArthur was willing to risk World War III against presidential orders, maybe he was dangerous. MacArthur's approval ratings started dropping as people realized he had been insubordinate and reckless. By summer Fay, more Americans supported Truman's decision than opposed it. MacArthur's political career collapsed. He didn't run for president in Fay. He faded into retirement, giving occasional speeches, but no longer a major political force. Meanwhile, Truman's decision to fire him became recognized as an act of courage and principle. Historians began comparing it favorably to Lincoln's struggles with McClellan, another general who had thought himself more important than the president. In later years after leaving office, Truman often spoke about the MacArthur firing. In a Fay interview, he explained his thinking. Roosevelt let MacArthur get away with insubordination for years. It was politically easier than confronting him, but it was wrong, and it created a situation where MacArthur thought he was untouchable. When I became president, I decided I wouldn't make that mistake. When MacArthur defied me, I fired him. Simple as that. A general who won't follow orders isn't a general. He is a threat to democracy. Truman also reflected on what Roosevelt's mistake had caused. If Roosevelt had disciplined MacArthur back in Fay, if he'd made clear that generals serve at presidential pleasure and must follow orders, maybe MacArthur wouldn't have thought he could defy me in Fay. Maybe he would have understood that his job was to implement policy, not make it. But Roosevelt didn't do that. He took the easy path politically, and I had to clean up the mess. The firing of MacArthur established a principle that endures today. Generals serve the president, not the other way around. No matter how famous, how successful, how beloved a general becomes, the president has the constitutional authority and responsibility to relieve him if he becomes insubordinate. Truman paid a heavy political price for enforcing that principle, but he never regretted it. The contrast between Roosevelt and Truman on this issue reveals something important about both presidents. Roosevelt was brilliant at many things, but he had a tendency to avoid confrontations that might cost him politically, even when principle demanded confrontation. He let MacArthur run wild because firing him would have been unpopular. Truman, on the other hand, was willing to do what was right, even when it was politically suicidal. He fired MacArthur because the Constitution and the principle of civilian control demanded it, regardless of the cost. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, himself a five-star general, was elected president. One of his first actions was to visit Truman for the transition. During their meeting, Eisenhower thanked Truman for firing MacArthur. Eisenhower explained, "You did what had to be done." MacArthur had forgotten that in our system, the military serves the civilian government. You reminded everyone of that, including the military. It made my job easier because no general will ever again think he is above presidential authority. Truman's response revealed how much Roosevelt's mistake had driven his decision. I learned from watching Roosevelt let MacArthur get away with insubordination during the war. Roosevelt was a great president, but he made a mistake by not controlling MacArthur. I wasn't going to repeat it. The Constitution isn't optional. Civilian control isn't negotiable. MacArthur forgot that. I reminded him. The firing of MacArthur was Truman's way of correcting Roosevelt's mistake, of establishing that no general, no matter how famous or successful, was bigger than the Constitution. It cost Truman politically in the short term, but it preserved a fundamental principle of American democracy. The military answers to civilian authority, and presidents must have the courage to enforce that regardless of political consequences. Looking back, Truman's firing of MacArthur stands as one of the most courageous decisions in presidential history, not because MacArthur was wrong strategically, though he was. Not because MacArthur was insubordinate, though he absolutely was, but because Truman was willing to sacrifice his own political standing to preserve constitutional principle. He learned from Roosevelt's mistake and refused to repeat it. That is what made Harry Truman, in this instance at least, a better president than Franklin Roosevelt. He had the courage to do what was right, even when it was politically devastating.